I'm James Fletcher, 31, and I've spent the last 2 years behind bars at Riverside State Penitentiary. Last month, my nightmare deepened when Guard Sergeant Morrison planted cocaine in my cell during a surprise inspection. The setup was flawless except, for one thing, he didn't know. I'd been secretly recording his threats and corruption for weeks, using a contraband phone hidden inside a hollowed-out legal book. What started as survival would soon bring down an entire network of dirty guards. The device captured everything: his whispered threats, his coordination with dealers, his systematic exploitation of vulnerable inmates. Every conversation, every shakedown, every moment of abuse, all documented in crystal-clear audio that would eventually reach the right ears. Like and subscribe if you've ever felt trapped by a system designed to crush you, because what happened next changed everything. This is my story of how one hidden recording device became the key to exposing institutional corruption and finding justice behind bars. 2 years ago, I was just another working-class guy trying to make an honest living. I ran a small auto repair shop in downtown Springfield, fixing beat-up cars for people who couldn't afford the fancy dealership prices. My hands were always greasy, my back always ached, but I was proud of the work. I was building something real, something that mattered to my community. Everything changed the night my younger sister Megan called me, sobbing into the phone. Her boyfriend Troy had put her in the hospital again, this time with 3 broken ribs and a black eye that made her unrecognizable. The police wouldn't do anything meaningful. They'd filed reports before, taken photos, made promises, but Troy always found his way back to her, and the system always found reasons why their hands were tied. That night, I drove to Troy's apartment with nothing but rage in my heart and a tire iron in my hand. I didn't go there to kill him, but I went there to make sure he'd never hurt my sister again. When he answered the door, drunk and laughing about what he'd done to Megan, something inside me snapped. The tire iron connected with his shoulder, then his knee. I wanted him to feel a fraction of the pain he'd caused her. The original arrest report tells a different story, though. According to the police documentation, I was a dangerous repeat offender with a history of violence completely fabricated. Details that painted me as a career criminal rather than a desperate brother protecting his family. The report claimed I'd threatened multiple witnesses and resisted arrest violently, none of which was true. But who was going to believe a mechanic over sworn police officers? My public defender barely glanced at the case. He recommended a plea deal. Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, 5 to 7 years. Fighting it meant risking 15 to 20 if we lost. With my sister's medical bills piling up and no money for a real attorney, I took the deal. 5 years seemed survivable. I had no idea what I was walking into. Riverside State Penitentiary squatted on 300 acres of barren land like a concrete tumor. The walls rose 30 feet high, topped with razor wire that gleamed like metallic teeth in the morning sun. During processing, I kept my head down and my mouth shut. I'd heard enough stories to know that showing weakness or fear was a death sentence in places like this. Sergeant Morrison first approached me during my second week. He was a big man, maybe 6'4", the graying temples and the kind of authoritative presence that commanded instant respect. Unlike the other guards who treated inmates like livestock, Morrison seemed different. He knew inmates' names, asked about their families, showed what appeared to be genuine concern for their well-being. "Fletcher, right?" I said one afternoon as I sat alone in the rec yard. "Heard you're here for protecting your sister? It takes guts. Not many men would risk everything for family like that." I should have been suspicious of his interests, but after weeks of being treated like scum, his recognition of my humanity felt like a lifeline. Morrison became my informal protector, steering me away from trouble, offering advice about surviving prison politics, even getting me assigned to the less dangerous work details. For months, everything seemed legitimate. Morrison would check on me during his rounds, make sure I wasn't having problems with other inmates, occasionally slip me an extra portion during meals. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, there were still decent people working within this broken system. The first sign something was wrong came about 8 months into my sentence. Morrison pulled me aside after dinner, his friendly demeanor replaced by something harder, more calculating. "James, I've been looking out for you, keeping you safe, but protection in here isn't free. Time you started showing some appreciation." He wanted me to carry messages between inmates and guards. Nothing too serious at first, just pass along information about upcoming cell searches, let certain people know when shifts were changing, small favors that seemed harmless enough. When I hesitated, Morrison's expression darkened. "You think your safety is guaranteed, Fletcher? You think I can't make your life very difficult in here? One word from me, and you'll find yourself in situations that make your current problems look like vacation." That was the moment I realized I'd been played from the beginning. Morrison hadn't been protecting me out of kindness. He'd been grooming me, building up my trust and dependence so he could eventually exploit me. The friendly guard who'd seemed like my salvation was actually my predator, and I'd walked right into his trap. Morrison had been working at Riverside for 15 years, and his personnel file read like a model employee's resume. Commendations for bravery, perfect attendance, glowing reviews from supervisors who praised his dedication to rehabilitation and inmate welfare. On paper, he was exactly the kind of guard the system claimed to want. Firm but fair, respected by inmates and colleagues alike. The reality was far more sinister. Morrison had spent those 15 years perfecting a system of exploitation that would have impressed organized crime bosses. He'd identified every weakness in the prison's oversight, every blind spot in the security cameras, every moment when he could operate without scrutiny. His reputation for fairness was actually cover for the most sophisticated protection racket I'd ever witnessed. Morrison's personal schedule, which I glimpsed during one of our mentoring sessions, revealed the true scope of his operation. He'd arranged his duty rotations to coincide with specific events: drug deliveries, inmate transfers, disciplinary hearings where he could influence outcomes. Every shift was strategically planned to maximize his control and profit. His target selection was methodical and cruel. Morrison focused on inmates with longer sentences who had families on the outside, men who were desperate for any connection to the world beyond these walls. Study our files, looking for pressure points. Sick relatives, children who needed support, elderly parents struggling with medical bills. Then he'd offer solutions that came with strings attached. "Your daughter's starting college soon, right, Fletcher?" he mentioned casually one day, somehow knowing details about my family that weren't in my official records. "Expensive these days. Education costs. Good thing you've got people looking out for you in here." The protection racket operated like a twisted insurance policy. Morrison would collect commissary money, personal items, even phone privileges in exchange for safety services. Inmates who paid found themselves mysteriously avoided by troublemakers, got better work assignments, received their mail without delay. Those who refused to participate faced a series of escalating problems that always seemed random but followed predictable patterns. I watched it happen to Kevin Martinez, a soft-spoken guy serving time for embezzlement. When Kevin refused to hand over his weekly commissary allowance, he suddenly found himself targeted by the Aryan Brotherhood. His cell was ransacked during routine searches. His mail disappeared. Other inmates started avoiding him, like he carried some contagious disease. Within 2 weeks, Kevin was begging Morrison for protection, willing to pay double the original asking price. Morrison accepted his plea with mock reluctance, as if he were doing Kevin a tremendous favor by allowing him back into the protection program. The whole thing was orchestrated theater, and I was beginning to understand my role in the production. The first direct threat came when I refused to carry drugs from the visiting room to another inmate's cell. Morrison cornered me in the supply closet during my janitorial duty, his massive frame blocking the only exit. The friendly mask had completely dropped, replaced by something cold and predatory. "You think you're special, Fletcher? You think your situation is different from everyone else's in here?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but the menace was unmistakable. "I've broken bigger men than you, made them disappear into the system, where nobody cares what happens to them." He stepped closer, his breath hot against my face. "Your sister Megan is doing better, I hear, working at that little diner downtown, trying to get her life back together. Be a shame if something happened to interrupt that progress." The threat was clear: comply or watch Morrison's reach extend beyond these walls, to hurt the very person I'd tried to protect. I felt my stomach drop as I realized the depth of his network and the lengths he'd go to maintain control. This wasn't just about prison corruption. This was about a man who'd weaponized the entire system to serve his personal agenda. That night in my cell, I made a decision that would change everything. If Morrison was going to threaten my family, if he was going to continue destroying vulnerable men for his own profit, then someone needed to document what was really happening behind these walls. The system had failed to protect us through official channels, but maybe there was another way. I started planning how to get my hands on a recording device. In a place where contraband was currency and information was power, everything was available for the right price. I just had to be smart enough to acquire what I needed without Morrison discovering my true intentions. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who'd taught me how to survive in prison was about to become the target of everything he'd taught me. Morrison had created his own worst enemy by trying to turn me into his accomplice. The commissary transaction records I eventually obtained revealed the true scope of Morrison's operation. What I'd initially thought was one corrupt guard skimming money from desperate inmates was actually a sophisticated network involving multiple staff members and systematic theft of thousands of dollars monthly from inmate accounts. Guard Thompson, a thin, nervous man with darting eyes, handled the money laundering. He'd process fake purchases through the commissary system, creating receipts for items that were never delivered while siphoning the funds into accounts controlled by the corrupt guards. Inmate would pay for protection or privileges, but the official records would show routine purchases of toiletries or snacks that never materialized. Guard Lewis managed the supply chain for contraband. His position overseeing deliveries and inventory gave him perfect cover to smuggle in drugs, cell phones, and other banned items that Morrison's network would then sell to inmates at inflated prices. Lewis had been doing this so long that he'd established relationships with suppliers outside the prison, creating a pipeline that operated with almost corporate efficiency. The three guards coordinated their shifts to ensure someone from their network was always on duty during critical operations. They'd arranged their schedules so that drug deliveries, inmate shakedowns, and disciplinary actions always happened under their oversight. This way, they could protect their operation while eliminating threats from inmates who might expose them. I witnessed the system in action one Tuesday evening when Morrison orchestrated a drug handoff with Kevin Martinez. Kevin had been forced deeper into Morrison's web after the protection racket incident, and now he was being used as a distribution point for marijuana and pills that came through Lewis's supply chain. From my position mopping the hallway, watched Morrison approach Kevin's cell during evening rounds. Their conversation was brief and coded, but the exchange was unmistakable. Kevin handed over cash while Morrison slipped him a small package wrapped in plastic. The whole transaction took less than 30 seconds, but it represented everything wrong with the system that was supposed to be rehabilitating us. What made this particularly evil was how they used planted evidence to silence potential whistleblowers. Morrison kept blank disciplinary write-up forms in his locker, ready to fabricate violations against any inmate who showed signs of resistance or independence. An inmate who refused to participate in their schemes would suddenly be found with contraband during a random search, face extended sentences, or find themselves transferred to more dangerous facilities. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as the financial crimes. Morrison had studied each inmate's vulnerabilities and used them like weapons. Men with sick families found their medical information mysteriously shared with Morrison, who would then offer to arrange special phone privileges or extended visits in exchange for cooperation. Inmates with upcoming parole hearings discovered that Morrison had connections with the review board who could influence their cases. I realized that Morrison's apparent knowledge about my sister hadn't been casual conversation. He'd been researching my family, gathering information he could use as leverage. The friendly mentor routine was actually intelligence gathering, building psychological profiles he could exploit, but he needed compliance. The network's reach extended beyond the three core guards. I started noticing patterns in how certain administrative staff processed grievances, how some medical personnel scheduled appointments, even how kitchen workers distributed meals. Morrison had built a corruption ecosystem where multiple departments contributed to maintaining his control. During one particularly revealing incident, I overheard Thompson and Lewis discussing quotas with Morrison. They had monthly targets for how much money they needed to extract from inmates, and they tracked their performance like salespeople chasing commissions. They discussed which inmates had the most commissary money, whose families sent the most support, and how to maximize their earnings from each source. The casual cruelty of their conversations was staggering. These men talked about ruining lives, extending sentences, and destroying families with the same tone others might use to discuss weekend plans. To them, we weren't human beings serving our time and trying to rebuild. Our lives, we were revenue streams to be optimized and exploited. That night, lying in my narrow bunk, I understood that I wasn't just fighting for my own survival anymore. Morrison's network was systematically destroying dozens of men and their families, turning what should have been a process of justice and rehabilitation into a predatory criminal enterprise. Someone had to document this corruption and find a way to expose it to people who could actually do something about it. I started making mental notes about schedules, observing patterns, and identifying the full scope of who was involved. If I was going to take on this network, I needed to understand exactly how it operated and who all the players were. The recording device I was planning to acquire wouldn't just be documenting. MorrisonNet would be capturing evidence of a conspiracy that reached throughout the institution. Getting the recording device required 3 weeks of careful negotiation and trading. Charlie Washington, a lifer who ran the prison's unofficial electronics repair service, had access to smartphones that had been smuggled in through various channels. His price was steep: 2 months of commissary privileges and a promise to share any recordings that might benefit other inmates fighting the system. The device itself was smaller than I had expected, a compact Android phone that Charlie had modified to extend battery life and improve audio sensitivity. He'd hollowed out my old legal reference book, carefully cutting away pages to create a cavity that would hold the phone while leaving enough text visible to maintain the illusion of a normal book. The first close call happened during my second day of recording. I was in the library, positioned where I could capture conversations between Morrison and other guards. When Morrison himself walked directly toward my table, the phone was recording in my lap, hidden inside the legal book, but Morrison's approach was so sudden that I had no time to properly conceal it. "Fletcher, what are you studying so hard?" Morrison asked, reaching toward the book. My heart hammered as I casually closed the book with the recording device inside, praying the motion looked natural. "Just reviewing appeals procedures," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady, trying to understand my options. Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded and moved on. I realized later that he'd probably been testing me, looking for signs of suspicious behavior. The fact that I'd appeared to be studying legal material, something many inmates did, legitimately had provided perfect cover for my actual activities. The second near miss was far more dangerous. During a random cell search 3 weeks into my recording operation, I was in the shower when guards began tearing apart my belongings. The phone was hidden in the legal book on my small shelf, but I could hear them getting closer to discovering it. Guard Thompson was leading the search, and I could hear him flipping through books and papers with increasing frustration. When I returned from the shower, he was holding my legal reference book, weighing it in his hands with a puzzled expression. "This book feels weird," he muttered to his partner. "Like it's been messed with." I forced myself to appear annoyed by the search, rather than terrified. "That's my appeals research," I said, with just the right amount of indignation. "I've been taking notes in the margins for months. Hope you didn't mess up my bookmarks." Thompson flipped through a few pages, saw my handwritten notes and highlighted passages, and tossed the book back onto my shelf with disinterest. He had no idea he'd been holding evidence that could destroy Morrison's entire operation. But Morrison was becoming suspicious of my behavior. He'd started watching me more carefully, asking pointed questions about my activities, and positioning himself where he could observe my movements during rec time and meals. I could feel his attention like a weight on my shoulders, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he'd figure out what I was really doing. The disciplinary write-up forms Morrison kept ready became a constant threat hanging over my head. These blank forms, which he could fill out with any fabricated violation, represented his power to make my life infinitely worse on a whim. I'd seen him use them against other inmates who'd crossed him, and I knew that one wrong move would result in solitary confinement, extended sentences, or transferred to facilities where my survival would be far from guaranteed. Warden Hutchinson seemed genuinely unaware of the corruption happening under his authority. During the few occasions when I'd seen him interact with inmates, he appeared to be a decent man who believed his facility was being run properly. Morrison and his network had been careful to maintain a facade of professionalism when officials were watching, reserving their criminal activities for moments when oversight was minimal. This realization created a terrible dilemma. The official channels for reporting abuse appeared to be honest, but they were also completely ineffective because they couldn't see what was really happening. Hutchinson received reports that had been filtered through Morrison's network, so any complaints about guard misconduct were either buried or dismissed as attempts by troublemakers to avoid consequences for their own actions. The isolation was perhaps the worst part of this entire experience. I couldn't confide in other inmates because I wasn't sure who might be working with Morrison or who might accidentally reveal my activities. I couldn't trust the official reporting systems because Morrison controlled too much of the information flow. I was essentially fighting this battle alone, armed with nothing but a hidden recording device and the hope that someone, somewhere, would eventually listen to what I was documenting. During this period, I started experiencing symptoms that I now recognize as severe anxiety and paranoia. I was constantly checking over my shoulder, analyzing every conversation for hidden meanings, and living in a state of hypervigilance that was mentally and physically exhausting. The weight of what I was attempting taking on an entrenched system of corruption with virtually no support began to feel overwhelming. But every time I considered giving up, I'd remember Morrison's threats against my sister, or I'd witness another vulnerable inmate being exploited by his network. These moments of moral clarity kept me going when my courage faltered, reminding me that someone had to document what was happening and find a way to expose it to the outside world. Morrison's decision to eliminate me permanently didn't happen overnight. It was the result of mounting pressure from multiple directions. His network was generating more scrutiny from administrative staff who were beginning to notice irregularities. In commissary accounts and inmate transfers, several inmates had filed formal complaints that, while individually dismissed, were creating a pattern that could eventually attract serious investigation. More immediately threatening to Morrison was my refusal to escalate my participation in his operations. He'd been pushing me to recruit other inmates to take on more dangerous responsibilities in his drug distribution network, and to provide intelligence about inmates who might be planning to report guard misconduct. My consistent resistance had marked me as a liability rather than an asset, the evidence locker key. Morrison represented the scope of his authority and the tools he used to destroy lives. With access to the facility's evidence storage, he could plant contraband in ways that appeared completely legitimate, manipulate drug test results, and even alter physical evidence related to inmate disciplinary cases. This key was essentially a license to fabricate whatever reality served his purposes. Morrison's coordination with his outside dealer contact required careful timing and absolute secrecy. Through conversations I'd recorded, I learned that he had a connection with a man named Rico, who supplied high-quality cocaine specifically for planting on inmates. This wasn't street-level drugs that might be questioned for purity or origin. This was evidence-grade material that would stand up to forensic analysis and legal scrutiny. The cocaine had to be precisely measured to trigger serious charges, but not so much that it would suggest major dealing activity that might bring federal attention. Morrison wanted enough to add 3 to 5 years to my sentence, sufficient to keep me locked up long enough for his network to solidify their control and eliminate any remaining threats to their operation. During the week leading up to the plant, Morrison's behavior toward me shifted dramatically. The pretense of mentorship disappeared entirely, replaced by barely concealed hostility and increasingly overt threats. He'd make comments about inmates who disappeared into the system, transferred to facilities where accidents happened more frequently. "You know, Fletcher," he said during one particularly menacing encounter, "some people think they're smarter than everyone else, think they can play games with people who've been doing this longer than they've been alive. Those people usually learn some hard lessons about respect." His comments about my sister became more frequent and more specific. He'd mention details about her work schedule, her apartment, even her new boyfriend information that could only have come from active surveillance. The message was clear. His reach extended far beyond these prison walls, and my refusal to cooperate was putting everyone I cared about at risk. I made the decision to record continuously during this period. Despite the significant drain on the phone's battery life, Charlie had taught me how to maximize recording time while minimizing power consumption. But continuous operation meant I had to be extremely careful about finding opportunities to recharge the device without being detected. The preparation felt like getting ready for war with inadequate weapons. I was about to go up against a system that had been perfected over 15 years, armed with nothing but a contraband recording device and the desperate hope that someone would eventually listen to what I documented. The odds were overwhelmingly against me. But the alternative, allowing Morrison to continue destroying lives while silencing anyone who tried to resist, was unacceptable. I started writing detailed notes about everything I'd observed, creating a backup record in case something happened to the recordings. These notes were hidden in multiple locations throughout my cell and work areas, insurance against the possibility that Morrison's retaliation might include destroying the evidence. I'd gathered. The psychological pressure during this period was intense. I was essentially living as a spy within a hostile environment, knowing that discovery would mean not just the failure of my mission, but potentially my death. Morrison had demonstrated that he was willing to use violence to maintain control. Inmates who posed serious threats to his operation had a tendency to suffer accidents that ended their ability to testify against him. My sleep became fitful and filled with nightmares about failed escape attempts and violent retribution. During waking hours, I found myself constantly analyzing Morrison's behavior, looking for signs that he'd discovered my activities or was about to make his move against me. The waiting was almost worse than the anticipated confrontation itself, but I also felt a strange sense of purpose that I'd never experienced before. For the first time since entering prison, I was fighting back against the system that had been designed to break me. Instead of being a passive victim of institutional abuse, I was actively working to expose the truth, potentially protect other inmates from the same exploitation I'd witnessed. The final trap was being set, and both Morrison and I knew it. The question was whether my hidden recordings would be enough to survive what was coming and ensure that the truth about his network would eventually reach people who could act on it. The morning of March 15th started like any other day at Riverside State Penitentiary. I could feel something different in the air. Morrison's behavior during the previous evening had been particularly agitated, and I'd noticed Thompson and Lewis having hushed conversations that stopped whenever other inmates came within hearing distance. The surprise inspection was announced over the intercom at 10:47 a.m., just after most inmates had settled into their morning work details. The timing was deliberate. Morrison wanted minimal witnesses for what was about to happen, and he needed to ensure that the drug plant would occur when. I had no alibi for how contraband might have entered my possession. I was in the library, ostensibly researching legal precedents, but actually positioning myself to record conversations between guards. When the lockdown order came, all inmates were required to return to their cells immediately for a facility-wide contraband search. My hands trembled slightly as I closed the legal book containing the recording device, knowing that this was likely the moment Morrison had been planning. The planted cocaine baggie was small, but perfectly prepared, exactly 3.7 grams of pure powder in a sealed plastic bag that looked like it had been professionally packaged. Morrison had chosen this amount carefully, enough to trigger serious drug possession charges that would add years to my sentence, but not so much that it would suggest major distribution activity that might bring unwanted federal attention to his facility. Morrison led the search team to my cell with theatrical precision. He moved through the mandatory preliminary procedures, checking common hiding spots, examining my bedding, going through my limited personal possessions while maintaining a performance of professional thoroughness for the other guards present. Fletcher, step out of the cell and assume the position against the wall, Morrison commanded, his voice carrying just the right amount of routine authority. I complied, pressing my palms against the concrete while he continued his systematic search of my belongings. The recording device captured every sound, Morrison's heavy breathing as he worked, the rustle of papers being examined, the metallic scraping of my small shelf being moved. Then came the moment I'd been dreading, and simultaneously preparing for. Well. Morrison's voice carried a note of theatrical surprise that would have been convincing to anyone who didn't know the truth. What do we have here? He held up the cocaine baggie, letting it catch the light streaming through my small cell window. The plastic crinkled as he examined it, and I could hear Thompson's sharp intake of breath behind him, whether from genuine surprise or practiced performance. I couldn't tell. This was hidden behind your legal books, Fletcher, Morrison announced loudly enough for inmates in neighboring cells to hear. Looks like someone's been supplementing their legal research with some recreational chemistry. The authentic shock and fear in my reaction weren't difficult to produce. Even though I'd known this moment was coming, even though I'd prepared for it mentally, the reality of being framed for a crime that would extend my sentence by years hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. That's not mine, I said, my voice cracking with genuine distress. I've never seen that before in my life. Someone planted that. Morrison's response was perfectly calibrated, not too aggressive, which might suggest personal animosity, but firmly dismissive in the way guards were trained to handle inmate denials of obvious guilt. That's what they all say, Fletcher. Amazing how drugs just mysteriously appear in cells, right? Must be the contraband fairy making her rounds. Thompson and the other guards chuckled at Morrison's joke, but I could hear something else in their laughter, nervousness, maybe even discomfort. Not everyone involved in this setup was completely comfortable with what they were witnessing. The immediate lockdown procedures kicked in with mechanical efficiency. I was handcuffed, removed from my cell, and escorted to the administrative segregation unit while Morrison documented the discovery and prepared paperwork for additional charges. The whole process felt surreal. It's like watching someone else's life fall apart while being powerless to intervene. As they led me away from my cell, I heard Morrison talking quietly to Thompson about the successful bust and how satisfied the warden would be with their proactive approach to drug enforcement. The casual satisfaction in his voice as he discussed destroying my life was more chilling than any direct threat he'd ever made. The recording device, still hidden in the legal book that had been left in my cell, continued capturing audio from Morrison's post-search conversation. His whispered comments to Thompson revealed the calculated nature of the frame-up and his confidence that this latest victim would be successfully silenced. "That takes care of our Fletcher problem," Morrison murmured. 3 more years minimum. Probably 5 with his prior record. By the time he gets out, if he gets out, nobody's going to care about whatever stories he thinks he has to tell. Those words captured in crystal clear audio, along with everything else I documented over the past months, would eventually become some of the most damning evidence in the case against Morrison's network. But in that moment, being processed into solitary confinement with a cocaine possession charge hanging over my head, I felt like I was drowning in a system designed to crush anyone who dared to fight back. The irony was devastating. Morrison's attempt to silence me permanently had been recorded by the very device I'd been using to document his corruption. His confidence in the success of his frame-up had made him careless about what he said and where he said it. The trap he'd set for me was about to become his own downfall, but I wouldn't understand that until much later. Solitary confinement at Riverside State Penitentiary was designed to break the human spirit through systematic sensory deprivation and psychological isolation. My cell measured 8 feet by 10 feet, containing nothing but a concrete slab bed, a stainless steel toilet sink combination, and a small slot in the door for food delivery. The walls were painted institutional green, color chosen specifically because studies had shown it increased depression and anxiety in confined subjects. The solitary confinement log documented every aspect of my existence in administrative segregation, meal times, bathroom breaks, the 15 minutes of outdoor exercise I was allowed every other day in a concrete cage, barely larger than my cell. What the log couldn't capture was the psychological torture of complete isolation. The way silence became a living thing that pressed against your eardrums. The way your own breathing became unnaturally loud in the absence of any other human sounds. During my first week in solitary, I experienced what psychologists call the breakdown period, the point where isolation begins to fundamentally alter brain chemistry and cognitive function. I started talking to myself just to hear a human voice, even my own. I created elaborate mental conversations with my sister, my parents, even with Morrison himself, playing out scenarios where I confronted him with evidence of his crimes. The despair was overwhelming. I'd gone from having a clear plan and a sense of purpose to being completely powerless, facing additional years in prison for a crime I hadn't committed. The cocaine charge would likely add 5 years to my sentence, maybe more, given my original conviction. I was looking at the possibility of spending the rest of my 30s behind bars. And by the time I got out, my sister would have built a life that didn't include her criminal brother, but the hidden recording device continued operating in my abandoned cell. And the conversations it captured during those first days after my setup provided some of the most damning evidence against Morrison's network. Guards who thought I was safely neutralized spoke more freely about their operations, discussing plans and revealing details they never would have shared if they'd known someone was still listening. Morrison visited my cell regularly during my first 2 weeks in solitary, ostensibly to check on my welfare, but actually to gloat over his successful frame-up. These visits were perhaps the most psychologically damaging part of the entire experience, as he made it clear that he could now destroy my life with complete impunity. "How are you adjusting to your new accommodations, Fletcher?" he'd ask with mock concern. "I know this isn't what you're used to, but drug dealers need to face the consequences of their choices." He'd lean against my cell door, close enough that I could see the satisfaction in his eyes through the small window. You know what I find interesting about your case? How someone who claimed to be so concerned about following the rules ended up with high-grade cocaine in his cell. Makes you wonder what other rules you might have been breaking that we haven't discovered yet. The threats were always carefully phrased to sound like routine guard supervision rather than personal vendetta. But the message was unmistakable. Morrison had won completely, and I was powerless to do anything about it. He controlled my environment, my future, even my ability to communicate with the outside world. During my darkest moments, I seriously considered giving up entirely. The weight of fighting against such an entrenched system of corruption, the isolation, of being unable to trust anyone, the prospect of spending additional years in prison for a crime I hadn't committed, it all felt insurmountable. I understood why so many inmates eventually stopped fighting and accepted whatever fate the system imposed on them. But something kept me going during those hellish weeks. The knowledge that the recording device was still operating, still documenting conversations and activities that could eventually expose the truth. Even though I couldn't access the recordings, even though I had no way of knowing whether anyone would ever hear them, the possibility that Morrison's crimes were being preserved gave me a thin thread of hope to cling to. I started using my time in solitary to mentally prepare for the legal battle I knew was coming. I reviewed every conversation I'd had with Morrison, every instance of corruption I'd witnessed, every detail that might be relevant to building a case against his network. My memory became my most important asset, and I worked to preserve every piece of evidence I'd gathered before my isolation. The ambient conversations outside my cell, captured by the still recording device in my abandoned belongings, revealed that Morrison's confidence in his success was making him increasingly careless. He discussed future operations openly, planned new schemes to exploit vulnerable inmates, and even bragged about his successful frame-up to guards who weren't part of his inner circle. One conversation that would later prove crucial occurred 3 weeks into my solitary confinement, when Morrison was training a new guard named Rodriguez on proper search procedures. In explaining how to identify inmates who might be hiding contraband, Morrison inadvertently described the exact process he'd used to plant drugs in my cell, complete with details about timing, positioning, and documentation that only someone who'd orchestrated the setup would know. By the end of my first month in administrative segregation, I'd reached what I now recognize as a psychological turning point. The despair and helplessness began transforming into something harder and more focused. Determination. Morrison had taken everything he could from my freedom of movement, my social connections. Even years of my life through his frame-up, but he couldn't take my knowledge of what he'd done or my commitment to eventually exposing his crimes. The mental preparation I did during those weeks of isolation would prove essential when I finally had the opportunity to fight back. Instead of being broken by the experience of solitary confinement, I used it to become more focused, more determined, and more committed to ensuring that Morrison's network would eventually face justice for their crimes against vulnerable inmates and their families. Attorney Patricia Walsh entered my life like a reluctant savior, carrying a battered briefcase and wearing the exhausted expression of someone who'd been fighting losing battles in the public defender's office for 15 years. Her case file on my drug possession charges was depressingly thin: a few police reports, Morrison's incident documentation, and a cursory review of my prison record that painted me as exactly the kind of inmate who would smuggle cocaine. Walsh's initial skepticism about my claims was understandable given her experience. She'd heard countless inmates insist they'd been framed, that evidence had been planted, that corrupt guards were targeting them specifically. In her world, these stories were usually desperate attempts to avoid responsibility for genuine crimes, and she'd learned to focus on negotiating plea deals rather than chasing conspiracy theories that rarely had supporting evidence. Mr. Fletcher, I've reviewed your case, and the evidence against you is quite substantial, she said during our first meeting in the small attorney consultation room. High-grade cocaine was found in your personal belongings, and there's no indication of any procedural violations during the search. My recommendation is that we explore a plea agreement that might minimize the additional time you'll serve. The moment I mentioned the recordings, Walsh's entire demeanor changed. The tired resignation in her eyes was replaced by sharp attention. As I explained how I'd been documenting Morrison's corruption for months, how the planted drugs were retaliation for my refusal to participate in his network, and how the evidence of his crimes was still hidden in my abandoned cell. You're telling me you have audio recordings of guard misconduct? Walsh asked, leaning forward across the metal table. "And these recordings are still in your cell, in a device that prison officials don't know exists?" explained the contraband. "Phone hidden in the legal book, how Charlie Washington had modified it for extended recording capability, and how it had been capturing conversations continuously since before the drug plant." Walsh's legal training kicked in immediately as she began calculating the evidentiary challenges we'd face. "James, even if these recordings exist and contain what you claim, we have significant legal hurdles," she explained. "The evidence was obtained illegally, used contraband to record conversations without consent in a facility where such activity is strictly prohibited. Any prosecutor will argue that the recordings are inadmissible, but Walsh also understood that extraordinary circumstances might justify extraordinary measures. The corruption I was describing, if true, represented such a fundamental violation of inmates' rights and the integrity of the justice system that courts might be willing to consider illegally obtained evidence under whistleblower protections or public interest exceptions. The first challenge was retrieving the recordings without alerting Morrison's network to their existence. My belongings had been moved to storage after my placement in solitary confinement, but the legal book containing the device was likely still among my personal items. Walsh would need to petition for access to my property under the pretense of preparing my defense, then somehow extract the recording device without prison officials discovering it. Morrison's confidence in his successful frame-up actually worked in our favor during this phase. He'd become careless about surveillance, assuming that my isolation in solitary confinement meant I no longer posed any threat to his operations. He had no reason to suspect that evidence of his crimes was still being gathered and preserved. Walsh spent 3 weeks navigating the bureaucratic maze required to gain access to my stored belongings. She had to file multiple motions, attend hearings, and convince skeptical administrators that examining my personal property was essential to preparing an adequate defense. Prison officials treated her requests as routine nuisance filings from an overworked public defender, never suspecting the true purpose of her persistence. When Walsh finally retrieved the legal book containing the recording device, she discovered that it had captured over 200 hours of audio from my cell area and the surrounding corridors. The conversations included not just Morrison's post-setup gloating, but detailed discussions of ongoing criminal activities, plans for future operations, and casual admissions of past crimes that went far beyond anything I'd initially suspected. The quality of the recordings was remarkable. Charlie Washington's modifications had created a device capable of capturing conversations with courtroom-quality clarity, even through walls and across distances that should have made eavesdropping impossible. The evidence was so comprehensive and damning that Walsh knew immediately we weren't just fighting a drug possession charge. We were potentially taking down an entire criminal conspiracy. But Walsh also understood the dangers we were facing. Morrison's network had demonstrated their willingness to use violence, plant evidence, and manipulate official procedures to protect their operations. If they discovered that their crimes had been recorded and that we were preparing to expose them, both Walsh and I would become targets for retaliation that could extend far beyond the prison walls. The decision to move forward with exposing the recordings was perhaps the most consequential choice either of us had ever made. We were committing ourselves to a legal battle against an entrenched system of corruption, with opponents who had proven they would stop at nothing to maintain their power and protect their criminal enterprise. Detective William Harrison from Internal Affairs carried his badge like a burden rather than a symbol of authority. 22 years in law enforcement had taught him that corruption was a cancer that could consume entire institutions if left untreated. His internal affairs credentials represented both his commitment to rooting out that corruption and the isolation it brought from colleagues who viewed him as a threat. Harrison's initial contact with Attorney Walsh came through official channels, a routine inquiry about allegations of guard misconduct that had been filed in conjunction with my drug possession case. Walsh had submitted a formal complaint alleging systematic corruption at Riverside State Penitentiary, but she'd been careful not to mention the recordings until she could assess Harrison's credibility and commitment to genuine investigation. Skepticism in Harrison's voice during their first phone conversation was unmistakable. He'd investigated hundreds of allegations against prison staff, and the vast majority turned out to be either misunderstandings, personality conflicts, or desperate fabrications by inmates trying to avoid consequences for their own actions. Walsh's claims about widespread corruption and systematic abuse sounded like every other conspiracy theory he'd encountered in his career. Ms. Walsh, I appreciate your client's concerns, but allegations of guard misconduct require substantial evidence to justify investigation, Harrison explained. Inmates have powerful incentives to fabricate stories about staff behavior, especially when they're facing additional charges that could extend their sentences. Walsh played him the first recording. Harrison's training had taught him to recognize authentic evidence, and the conversation between Morrison and Thompson that emanated from Walsh's audio player was clearly genuine. The casual discussion of drug prices, distribution methods, and profit-sharing arrangements wasn't the kind of detailed criminal conversation that could be fabricated or misremembered. Jesus Christ, Harrison whispered as he listened to Morrison describing how he'd identified vulnerable inmates for exploitation. How long has this been going on? The recordings revealed corruption that extended far beyond Harrison's initial suspicions. He'd been investigating isolated incidents of misconduct, but the evidence Walsh presented demonstrated a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been operating for years with near-total impunity. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering: multiple guards,
administrative staff,
and outside collaborators working together to exploit inmates and their families for substantial financial gain. Harrison understood immediately that he was putting his career and potentially his life at risk by pursuing this investigation. Morrison's network had demonstrated their willingness to use violence and intimidation against anyone who threatened their operations. And internal affairs investigators weren't immune from retaliation by corrupt officers who felt cornered. But Harrison also recognized that this was exactly the kind of case he'd joined internal affairs to handle. The systematic abuse of power, the exploitation of vulnerable people, the complete corruption of institutions that were supposed to serve justice. These crimes struck at the heart of everything law enforcement was supposed to represent. The alliance between Harrison Walsh and myself created an unusual partnership that crossed traditional boundaries between law enforcement, legal advocacy, and inmate rights. Harrison provided official investigative authority and access to resources that Walsh couldn't obtain through normal legal channels. Walsh contributed legal expertise and constitutional protections that helped shield our activities from Morrison's network. I offered insider knowledge of prison operations and ongoing access to information about the corruption we were trying to expose. Other inmates began approaching me with their own stories of abuse and exploitation once word spread that someone was finally fighting back against Morrison's network. Men who had been silenced by fear, threats, and previous failed attempts to report misconduct started sharing detailed accounts of crimes they'd witnessed or experienced personally. Kevin Martinez, the embezzlement convict who'd been forced into Morrison's protection racket, provided crucial testimony about how the financial exploitation system operated. He'd kept careful records of his payments to Morrison, documentation that corroborated the patterns revealed in our recordings and provided additional evidence of the systematic nature of the corruption. Carlos Mendez, a drug offender who'd been used as a courier in Morrison's distribution network, offered evidence about how guards coordinated with outside dealers to smuggle contraband into the facility. His testimony revealed the sophistication of the supply chain and the level of planning required to maintain such extensive criminal operations within a supposedly secure environment. But our growing alliance also attracted Morrison's attention and triggered increasingly desperate attempts to silence us before we could expose his crimes. Harrison reported being followed after work, receiving anonymous threats against his family, and experiencing suspicious mechanical problems with his patrol car that suggested tampering by people with law enforcement knowledge. Walsh discovered that her office phones were being monitored and her case files had been accessed by unauthorized personnel. Someone with significant resources and institutional connections was tracking our investigation and looking for ways to undermine our efforts. Before we could present our evidence to federal authorities, the dangers we faced were real and escalating. But so was our determination to see justice served. Morrison's network had operated with impunity for too long, destroying lives and corrupting institutions that were supposed to protect vulnerable people. Our unlikely alliance represented perhaps the only chance to expose their crimes and prevent them from continuing to victimize inmates and their families. Harrison's decision to proceed with a full investigation despite the personal and professional risks demonstrated the kind of courage that the system needed more of. He understood that fighting corruption required people willing to sacrifice their own comfort and security for the greater good. And he was prepared to pay that price to ensure that justice was served. Detective Harrison's investigation into Morrison's network uncovered phone records that revealed the true scope of the corruption at Riverside State Penitentiary. The cell phone logs showed regular communication between Morrison and a network of contacts that extended far beyond the prison walls: drug dealers, corrupt law enforcement officers, prison contractors, and even local politicians who had financial interests in maintaining the status quo. The most shocking discovery was Assistant Warden Crawford's direct involvement in the protection racket. Crawford, who'd presented himself as a reform-minded administrator committed to rehabilitation and inmate welfare, was actually receiving monthly payments from Morrison's operation in exchange for administrative protection and advance warning about potential investigations. Crawford's participation explained how Morrison's network had operated with such impunity for so long. Whenever complaints about guard misconduct reached the administrative level, Crawford would either bury them entirely or redirect investigations towards scapegoats who weren't actually involved in the corruption. He'd cultivated a reputation as someone who took inmate grievances seriously, but he was actually using that trust to identify and neutralize threats to Morrison's operation. The financial records Harrison obtained through subpoena revealed how sophisticated the money laundering operation had become. Drug profits were being channeled through prison contractor accounts, creating the appearance of legitimate business transactions while actually serving as vehicles for distributing criminal proceeds among network members. One particularly damning conversation I'd recorded captured Morrison and Crawford discussing their partnership with unusual candor. Crawford had come to Morrison's office late one evening, after most staff had gone home, to discuss concerns about increased scrutiny from state prison inspectors. "We need to be more careful about the paper trail," Crawford's voice was clearly audible on the recording. "The state boys are asking questions about commissary discrepancies and inmate transfer patterns. They're not stupid, they know something's not adding up." Morrison's response revealed the casual arrogance that had characterized his criminal enterprise. "Let them ask questions. We've got enough people in the right places to manage any investigation that comes our way. Besides, what are they going to do? Take the word of convicted felons over respected law enforcement officers?" But Crawford was more worried than Morrison about the sustainability of their operation. "Bill, we're taking too much money out of the system. The commissary shortfalls are becoming impossible to explain through normal accounting irregularities. And some of these inmates are getting smart about documenting what's happening to them." The conversation continued with Crawford proposing that they temporarily reduce their criminal activities until the current wave of scrutiny passed. Morrison rejected this suggestion completely, arguing that backing down would be interpreted as weakness by both inmates and potential investigators. "The moment we show fear, we lose control," Morrison explained. "These people need to understand that we run this place, not them. Any inmate who thinks he can cause problems for us needs to learn the consequences of crossing the wrong people." Recorded conversation became crucial evidence in Harrison's investigation, because it established both men's awareness that their activities were criminal and their determination to continue. Despite mounting risks, Crawford's concerns about documentation and inmate testimony proved that he understood they were vulnerable to exposure if the right evidence reached the right people. Harrison's dangerous undercover work within the prison administration revealed additional layers of corruption that none of us had initially suspected. Maintenance contracts were being manipulated to create opportunities for smuggling contraband. Food service arrangements provided cover for money laundering operations. Even religious programs were being exploited to facilitate communication between inmates and outside criminal contacts. The realization that Morrison's corruption had metastasized throughout the institution was both depressing and motivating. It confirmed that the problems at Riverside weren't isolated incidents of individual misconduct. They represented systematic, institutional failure that required comprehensive reform rather than targeted disciplinary action. My role as a key witness was becoming increasingly dangerous as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. The people we were investigating had demonstrated their willingness to use violence, intimidation, and manipulation of official procedures to protect their interests. They had resources, connections, and institutional authority that made them formidable opponents, but the evidence we'd gathered was also becoming more comprehensive and damning with each new revelation. The recordings, combined with Harrison's official investigation and the testimony of other inmates, were building a case that would be difficult for even the most corrupt officials to dismiss or bury. The network's response to our investigation was becoming increasingly desperate and reckless. Morrison's attempts to intimidate witnesses were creating additional evidence of obstruction of justice. Crawford's efforts to manipulate official records were leaving documentary trails that supported our allegations. Their criminal enterprise, which had operated successfully through careful planning and institutional protection, was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own corruption. Harrison understood that we were approaching a critical decision, point where the investigation would either result in successful prosecutions or catastrophic retaliation against everyone involved. The evidence was strong enough to support criminal charges, but presenting it publicly would trigger responses from the network that could endanger witnesses and investigators. The moral weight of potentially putting other people at risk was enormous, but so was the responsibility to expose crimes that were continuing to harm vulnerable inmates and their families. Morrison's network wasn't going to reform itself or voluntarily end their criminal activities. They would continue exploiting people until someone with sufficient evidence and authority forced them to stop. The medical report documenting my injuries from the prison workshop accident read like a catalog of carefully inflicted trauma designed to intimidate without causing permanent disability. Severe bruising across my back and ribs, a concussion that left me disoriented for 3 days, and lacerations on my hands that required 12 stitches. All supposedly the result of a mechanical malfunction that prison officials claimed was completely unforeseeable. Morrison's escalation to physical violence marked a crucial turning point in our conflict. Until this incident, his retaliation had focused on psychological intimidation and manipulation of administrative procedures. The attack in the workshop represented his growing desperation as he realized that normal methods of silencing inmates weren't working against someone who had evidence of his crimes. The workshop accident itself was a masterpiece of calculated brutality disguised as mechanical failure. I'd been assigned to operate a metal press that had supposedly developed a hydraulic leak, causing the safety mechanisms to malfunction at the exact moment I was positioning a piece of steel for forming. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, but proving intentional sabotage would require technical expertise that wasn't available to prison investigators. Guard Thompson, who'd been supervising the workshop that day, provided testimony that supported the accidental malfunction theory, while subtly implying that my injuries were the result of my own carelessness in operating dangerous equipment. His report noted that I'd seemed distracted and inattentive during the work session, creating a narrative that blamed the victim rather than investigating potential sabotage. But the attack also revealed the limits of Morrison's institutional protection. The severity of my injuries required medical treatment that created official documentation, and the suspicious circumstances of the accident attracted attention from administrators who weren't part of his network. Questions were being asked about workshop safety procedures and guard supervision that Morrison couldn't completely control. Detective Harrison's protection efforts were constrained by his official authority and the need to maintain his cover while conducting the ongoing investigation. He couldn't provide direct physical security without revealing his involvement in our case, but he worked behind the scenes to ensure that I received proper medical treatment, and that the incident was documented through channels that Morrison couldn't manipulate. The failed attempt to retrieve or destroy my evidence occurred during my hospitalization for the workshop injuries. While I was sedated and unable to protect my belongings, unknown individuals conducted an unauthorized search of my stored property. It's clearly looking for something specific, rather than conducting routine contraband screening. My legal books had been carefully examined, with pages rifled through and bindings checked for hidden compartments. Personal letters had been read and replaced in different order than I'd left them. Even my limited clothing had been searched thoroughly, suggesting that someone knew I'd been hiding something and was desperate to find whatever evidence I might have gathered. The search was unsuccessful because Attorney Walsh had already retrieved the recording device, but the fact that it had occurred confirmed that Morrison's network knew I was documenting their activities and were actively trying to eliminate evidence of their crimes. This attempt at evidence tampering created additional charges that Harrison could potentially use against the perpetrators if we could identify who had conducted the illegal search. Harrison's own safety became increasingly compromised as his investigation progressed. Anonymous threats against his family escalated from vague warnings to specific knowledge about his children's school schedules and his wife's work routines. Someone with access to law enforcement databases was providing detailed intelligence about his personal life to people who intended to use that information for intimidation. The mechanical problems with Harrison's patrol car weren't random equipment failures, they were deliberate sabotage designed to create dangerous situations that could result in accidents appearing to be coincidental. Brake lines that had been partially severed, steering components that had been loosened, electrical systems that had been tampered with to create failures at critical moments. Harrison's growing fear for his safety and the safety of other witnesses created a terrible moral dilemma. Continuing the investigation was putting people at risk of serious harm or death, but abandoning it would allow Morrison's network to continue victimizing vulnerable inmates with complete impunity. The isolation of fighting such a powerful and well-connected criminal organization was psychologically devastating. Couldn't trust official channels because we didn't know who else might be compromised. Couldn't seek help from other law enforcement agencies without risking that information would be leaked back to Morrison's network. We were essentially operating as a small group of isolated individuals fighting against an institutional conspiracy. But the escalating retaliation also demonstrated that our investigation was having an impact Morrison's network wouldn't be taking such desperate risks if they didn't believe we posed a genuine threat to their operation. Their willingness to resort to violence and evidence tampering suggested that they were running out of safer options for maintaining their criminal enterprise. The point of no return was approaching for all parties involved. Morrison's network had committed crimes that would result in serious prison sentences if exposed, giving them powerful incentives to use any means necessary to silence witnesses and destroy evidence. Our investigation had progressed too far to abandon without achieving justice, but continuing forward meant accepting that we were placing our lives and the lives of other people at significant risk. The moral weight of this responsibility was enormous, but so was our obligation to expose crimes that were continuing to harm innocent people. Every day that Morrison's network continued operating, more inmates were being exploited. More families were being threatened, and more victims were being created by systematic institutional corruption. The anonymous tip letter appeared under my cell door during the night shift change, written in careful block letters on a piece of torn notebook paper that could have come from any inmate in the facility. The message was brief, but chilling. Morrison hired wolves to hurt you bad tomorrow during rec time. You got shivs and orders to make it look like gang business. Guard Richardson left this because he got kids and can't watch murder happen. Get word to your lawyer now. Richardson was a newer guard who'd started working at Riverside 6 months earlier. Someone I'd noticed because he treated inmates with basic human dignity, rather than the casual cruelty that characterized most staff interactions. His decision to warn me about Morrison's murder plot demonstrated that even within a corrupt system, some people retained enough conscience to risk their own safety to prevent innocent blood from being shed. The wolves referred to a white supremacist gang that controlled significant territory within the prison's racial hierarchy. They were known for their willingness to carry out violence for the right price, and their reputation for making attacks look like racial conflicts rather than contract killings. Morrison had apparently decided that my death needed to appear unrelated to his criminal activities, so he'd arranged for gang members to eliminate me. During a situation that would be easily dismissed as typical prison violence, the credible threat on my life created an immediate crisis that forced all parties to accelerate their timelines. Detective Harrison couldn't wait for additional evidence gathering or careful legal preparation. He needed to either place me in protective custody immediately or risk losing his key witness to murder. Attorney Walsh had to decide whether to reveal our investigation prematurely or allow me to remain in a situation where I might be killed before we could present our case. My decision to reveal everything to federal authorities was driven by the stark realization that Morrison's network had crossed a line from criminal exploitation to premeditated murder. If they were willing to have me killed to protect their operation, they would certainly eliminate other witnesses who might threaten them in the future. Staying silent was no longer an option that would protect anyone. The emergency meeting with Harrison and federal authorities took place in a secure conference room at the regional FBI field office. with agents from multiple departments participating via secure video conference. The scope of the evidence we presented: hundreds of hours of recordings, financial documentation, witness testimony, and proof of systematic corruption, required immediate coordination between various law enforcement agencies. Special Agent Martinez from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit took charge of the federal response, recognizing that the crimes we were documenting crossed multiple jurisdictional boundaries and required resources that local investigators couldn't provide. The involvement of drug trafficking, money laundering, official corruption, and conspiracy to commit murder meant that Morrison's network was facing federal charges that could result in life sentences for the primary participants. My placement in protective custody was arranged within hours of the emergency meeting, but it required careful coordination to avoid alerting Morrison's network that their murder plot had been discovered. Harrison arranged for me to be transferred to the medical unit for complications from my workshop injuries, creating a plausible cover story for my removal from general population. The secure medical facility provided better physical protection than general population, but it also isolated me from the information network that had been crucial to our investigation. I could no longer observe Morrison's activities directly or gather intelligence about his network's responses to the increasing pressure they were facing from multiple investigations. Morrison's realization that his operation was fully exposed came when federal agents arrived at the prison with search warrants for guard lockers, administrative offices, and financial records. The coordinated raids were designed to preserve evidence and prevent destruction of documents that might be crucial to prosecuting the conspiracy charges. The point of no return for all parties involved had finally arrived. Morrison's network could no longer maintain the pretense that they were legitimate law enforcement officers conducting routine duties. Federal investigators were treating them as criminal suspects rather than fellow officers, and their institutional protection was evaporating as higher-level administrators scrambled to distance themselves from the corruption scandal. But the exposure of our investigation also meant that everyone involved, witnesses, investigators, and federal agents, was now at risk from desperate criminals who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their interests. The next phase of this conflict would determine whether justice would prevail or whether Morrison's network would succeed in eliminating the evidence and people who threatened their continued operation. The moral and practical stakes couldn't have been higher. We'd committed ourselves to a course of action that would either result in significant criminal convictions and institutional reform, or in the destruction of everyone who'd tried to expose the truth about systematic corruption. At Riverside State Penitentiary, the court transcript for my federal testimony runs to over 300 pages. It's documenting the moment when months of hidden recordings were finally presented as evidence in open court. Judge Patricia Stevens presided over the hearing with the gravity appropriate to charges of conspiracy, corruption, and civil rights violations that could fundamentally change how the entire state prison system operated. Federal prosecutors had spent weeks preparing the audio evidence for presentation, creating transcripts, verifying voice identifications, and establishing chains of custody that would withstand challenges from defense attorneys. The technical quality of the recordings was so clear that even Morrison couldn't deny that the voices belonged to him and his co-conspirators. Your Honor, the government presents Exhibit A47, a recording made on March 12th, capturing a conversation between Sergeant Morrison and Assistant Warden Crawford regarding their systematic exploitation of inmates for financial gain, announced Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Chen as she activated the courtroom audio system. Morrison's voice filled the federal courtroom with damning clarity. The beauty of this system is that nobody believes these guys when they complain. We're law enforcement officers with spotless records, and they're convicted criminals with every reason to lie. Even when they tell the truth, who's going to take their word over ours? The media attention began immediately after the first day of testimony. Local news stations picked up the story of corruption at Riverside State Penitentiary, but it quickly became a national scandal as the scope of the criminal enterprise became clear. Cable news programs featured legal experts discussing the implications of systematic prison corruption, while newspapers ran investigative pieces about similar problems at other facilities. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Families of current and former inmates began coming forward with their own stories of exploitation and abuse, describing suspicious financial transactions, threats against loved ones, and systematic harassment that now made sense in the context of Morrison's criminal network. The phones at Attorney Walsh's office rang constantly with calls from people seeking information about potential lawsuits and criminal referrals. Morrison's arrest occurred at his home on a quiet suburban street, surrounded by neighbors who had no idea that the respected corrections officer living next door had been running a criminal enterprise that had destroyed dozens of lives. Federal agents executed the arrest warrant at dawn, finding Morrison in his kitchen drinking coffee and reading newspaper coverage of the corruption scandal he'd created. The arrests of his co-conspirators followed in rapid succession. Guard Thompson was taken into custody at the prison during his regular shift, handcuffed in front of inmates and colleagues who watched in stunned silence as someone they'd viewed as an authority figure was led away like a common criminal. Guard Lewis was arrested at his second job, where he'd been working security at a shopping mall to supplement his prison salary. Assistant Warden Crawford's arrest created the biggest shockwaves throughout the state corrections department. Reputation as a reform-minded administrator who cared about inmate welfare made involvement in systematic exploitation particularly scandalous. The governor's office immediately announced a comprehensive review of all state prison facilities. It's promising zero tolerance for corruption and complete cooperation with federal investigations, but the public vindication of my claims was bittersweet. While I was finally being recognized as a whistleblower rather than a drug dealer, the process of achieving that recognition had cost me additional months in custody, subjected me to violence and intimidation, and put other people at risk of retaliation from desperate criminals. The ongoing investigation revealed that Morrison's network was part of a broader pattern of corruption that extended to other facilities throughout the state system. Federal agents were receiving information about similar schemes at prisons across multiple states, suggesting that the systematic exploitation of inmates is more widespread than anyone had initially suspected. Public outcry about the revelations led to immediate calls for prison reform from advocacy groups, editorial boards, and political leaders who recognized that the problems at Riverside represented fundamental failures in oversight and accountability. The corruption scandal became a catalyst for broader discussions about prison conditions, inmate rights, and the need for independent monitoring of correctional facilities. Morrison's desperate attempts to discredit me and the evidence continued, even after his arrest. His defense attorney argued that the recordings were fabricated, that I was a career criminal seeking revenge against guards who'd tried to maintain discipline, and that the entire investigation was based on unreliable testimony from convicted felons with easy motives to lie, but the technical evidence was overwhelming and independently verifiable. Voice analysis confirmed the identities of the speakers on the recordings. Financial records corroborated the illegal transactions described in the audio evidence. Multiple witnesses provided testimony that supported every major element of the prosecution's case. The transformation from imprisoned drug dealer to federal witness was surreal and emotionally complex. Media outlets that had initially ignored my allegations were now seeking interviews about prison reform and institutional corruption. Legal experts who would have dismissed my claims as typical inmate complaints were now citing my case as an example of why whistleblower protections needed to be strengthened. The validation was meaningful, but it couldn't undo the trauma of fighting such a powerful system of corruption with so little support for so long. The months of isolation, intimidation, and physical danger had left psychological scars that wouldn't heal simply because the truth had finally been acknowledged by official authorities. Morrison's resignation letter was a masterpiece of institutional doublespeak, carefully crafted by attorneys to minimize legal liability while creating the appearance of accepting responsibility. After careful consideration, I have decided to retire from my position at Riverside State Penitentiary to pursue other opportunities. While I disagree with certain allegations that have been made about my conduct, I recognize that my continued presence might create distractions from the important work of rehabilitation and public safety. The forced resignation was Morrison's last attempt to control the narrative around his criminal activities, but it came too late to affect the federal prosecution that was moving forward with devastating effectiveness. His 15-year career in corrections was ending not with the pension and recognition he'd expected, but with federal charges that would likely result in decades behind bars. Morrison's trial became a media spectacle that exposed the depth of institutional corruption at Riverside State Penitentiary. The parade of witnesses against him included not just inmates who'd been victimized by his network, but fellow guards who testified about the climate of fear and intimidation he'd created among staff members who'd tried to maintain professional Standards. Kevin Martinez's testimony was particularly powerful as he described how Morrison's protection racket had destroyed his relationship with his family and consumed his limited financial resources. He made me choose between my safety and my children's college fund, Kevin explained to the jury. Every week I had to decide whether to pay Morrison or send money home to my wife. There was no good choice. Either my family suffered or I risked being hurt by inmates. He could turn against me. Carlos Mendez provided detailed evidence about Morrison's drug distribution network, explaining how guards coordinated with outside dealers to smuggle contraband into the facility. His testimony revealed the sophisticated planning required to maintain such extensive criminal operations within a supposedly secure environment, demonstrating that Morrison's crimes weren't impulsive acts, but carefully orchestrated conspiracies. The conviction of Morrison, Thompson, and Lewis sent shockwaves throughout the corrections system. Morrison received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison for conspiracy, civil rights violations, drug trafficking, and racketeering. Thompson was sentenced to 15 years for his role in the money laundering operation. Lewis received 12 years for his management of the contraband supply chain. Assistant Warden Crawford's case was handled separately due to his higher position and greater culpability in enabling the corruption. His forced retirement came with the loss of his pension benefits, but more importantly, he faced federal charges that could result in a 30-year sentence. The man who had presented himself as a reform-minded administrator was revealed to be the institutional protector who had made Morrison's criminal enterprise possible. The dropping of charges against me was almost anticlimactic after the months of legal battles and media attention. Federal prosecutors acknowledged that the cocaine possession charges were the result of evidence planting by Morrison's network, and they formally apologized for the additional suffering I'd endured while fighting to prove my innocence. But the vindication came with a bittersweet recognition of the personal costs I'd paid to expose the truth. The additional months in custody, the violence I'd suffered, the psychological trauma of fighting such a powerful system of corruption. These losses couldn't be completely compensated by legal victory or public recognition of my courage. My role as a key witness in broader reform efforts extended far beyond Morrison's individual case. Federal investigators were using the evidence I'd gathered to examine similar corruption at other facilities throughout the state system. The recordings had revealed patterns of abuse that suggested systematic problems requiring comprehensive institutional changes rather than isolated disciplinary actions. The ongoing investigation into systematic prison corruption was uncovering additional criminal networks at facilities across multiple states. Morrison's operation at Riverside had been part of a broader culture of exploitation that had infected correction systems nationwide, and federal authorities were beginning to understand the true scope of the problem. The establishment of new oversight mechanisms was a direct result of the evidence I'd provided about how easily corruption could flourish in environments where inmates had limited ability to report abuse and officials had minimal external accountability. The reforms being implemented included independent monitoring systems, anonymous reporting procedures, and regular audits of financial transactions involving inmate accounts. The psychological impact of successfully exposing such extensive corruption was complex and emotionally challenging. While I felt vindicated by the convictions and policy changes that resulted from my efforts, I also struggled with survivor's guilt about inmates who had suffered under Morrison's network before I'd found the courage to document their crimes. The knowledge that Morrison would spend the next 25 years in the same type of facility where he'd victimize vulnerable people provided a sense of poetic justice that was deeply satisfying. He would experience firsthand the powerlessness and vulnerability that he'd exploited in others, and he would face the constant threat of violence from inmates who understood exactly what kind of person he really was. The new prison policy manual that emerged from the corruption scandal at Riverside State Penitentiary represented the most comprehensive reform of corrections procedures in the state's history. The 847-page document established oversight mechanisms, transparency requirements, and accountability measures specifically designed to prevent the kind of systematic exploitation that Morrison's network had perpetrated for years. Warden Hutchinson's leadership during the reform process demonstrated genuine commitment to institutional change rather than cosmetic adjustments designed to deflect criticism. He'd been genuinely shocked by the extent of corruption that had operated under his authority, and he embraced federal recommendations for comprehensive policy changes with the enthusiasm of someone who understood that his facility's reputation and his own career depended on meaningful reform. The implementation of new oversight and recording systems throughout the prison created unprecedented transparency in guard-inmate interactions. Body cameras became mandatory for all correctional staff, with footage automatically uploaded to secure servers that couldn't be accessed or modified by facility personnel. Random audio monitoring was installed in common areas, creating a permanent record of conversations that had previously occurred without any form of oversight. Anonymous reporting systems gave inmates multiple channels for reporting abuse without fear of retaliation from corrupt staff members. Secure telephone lines, confidential mail procedures, and regular visits from independent monitors created an environment where misconduct could be reported safely and investigated promptly by people who weren't part of the institutional hierarchy. My unexpected role as an advocate for prison reform grew naturally from my experience exposing Morrison's corruption. Federal officials, advocacy groups, and legislative committees sought my input on policy recommendations. Recognizing that someone who'd lived through systematic institutional abuse could provide insights that administrators and academic experts might miss, the mixed reactions from other inmates and guards to the reforms reflected the complex dynamics of institutional change in environments where unofficial power structures had operated for decades. Many inmates welcomed the increased oversight and accountability, but others worried that the new transparency would eliminate beneficial, informal arrangements they'd developed with sympathetic staff members, guards who hadn't been involved in. Morrison's network generally supported the reforms, recognizing that the new policies would protect them from false accusations while ensuring that genuinely corrupt colleagues couldn't continue victimizing vulnerable people. But some veteran staff members resented the increased scrutiny and complained that the new procedures made their jobs more difficult and less flexible. The slow but meaningful changes in prison culture were perhaps the most important long-term results of the corruption scandal. The message that systematic abuse would be investigated, prosecuted, punished, created a deterrent effect that extended far beyond the specific individuals who'd been involved in Morrison's network. Inmates began reporting misconduct more frequently, confident that their complaints would be taken seriously rather than dismissed or buried by corrupt administrators. Staff members became more careful about maintaining professional boundaries, understanding that their interactions with inmates were now subject to regular monitoring and review. The establishment of regular training programs on ethics, legal compliance, and professional conduct ensured that new employees understood the institutional commitment to preventing corruption from taking root again. These programs included case studies based on Morrison's crimes, using his network as an example of how seemingly small ethical compromises could escalate into serious criminal behavior. My growing understanding of my larger purpose evolved from the recognition that exposing Morrison's corruption had created opportunities for systemic change that could benefit thousands of current and future inmates. The evidence I'd gathered with a contraband recording device had become the foundation for policy reforms that would protect vulnerable people in ways that traditional oversight mechanisms had failed to achieve. The ripple effects of the Riverside scandal extended to other facilities throughout the state system. As administrators scrambled to implement similar reforms before their own institutions became the subject of federal investigation, the threat of prosecution and media exposure created powerful incentives for voluntary compliance with new transparency and accountability standards. Federal oversight of the reform process ensured that the changes weren't merely cosmetic adjustments, designed to satisfy critics without addressing underlying problems. Regular audits, surprise inspections, and ongoing monitoring by Department of Justice officials created sustained pressure for genuine institutional transformation rather than temporary policy modifications. The personal satisfaction of seeing meaningful change emerge from such a traumatic experience provided psychological healing that legal victory alone couldn't achieve. Knowing that other inmates would be protected from the kind of exploitation I'd witnessed and experienced gave deeper meaning to the suffering I'd endured while fighting. Morrison's network, the long-term commitment to preventing similar corruption, required ongoing vigilance from multiple stakeholders, including federal investigators, advocacy groups, media organizations, and informed citizens who understood that institutional reform required sustained attention rather than temporary outrage. About specific scandals, The GED certificate I earned while serving my remaining time at Riverside represented far more than educational achievement. It symbolized my determination to rebuild my life despite the system's attempts to break my spirit through corruption and institutional abuse. The certificate, signed by Warden Hutchinson himself, acknowledged not just my academic progress, but my role in exposing the crimes that had nearly destroyed me. My personal growth during the final months of incarceration was profound and transformative. The experience of fighting Morrison's network had forced me to develop psychological resilience, strategic thinking, and moral courage that I'd never known I possessed. I'd entered prison as a desperate man who'd made a violent mistake to protect his sister. I was preparing to leave as someone who understood his capacity to create meaningful change in unjust systems. The psychological healing from trauma, betrayal, was an ongoing process that required conscious effort and external support. The violence I'd suffered, the months of isolation and intimidation, constant fear of retaliation these experiences had left, emotional scars that wouldn't disappear simply because justice had been served and reforms had been implemented. Attorney Walsh arranged for me to receive counseling from a psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery for whistleblowers and institutional abuse survivors. Dr. Sarah Manning helped me understand that the hypervigilance, anxiety, and trust issues I was experiencing were normal responses to abnormal circumstances, and that healing would require time and professional guidance. The relationships I developed with other inmates who looked up to me as a hero created unexpected responsibilities and opportunities for positive influence. Men who had given up hope of ever receiving justice for their own experiences of abuse began approaching me for advice about reporting misconduct, filing grievances, and protecting themselves from retaliation. Kevin Martinez, whose testimony had been crucial in convicting Morrison, credited our conversations with giving him the courage to rebuild his relationship with his family after months of shame and isolation. "You showed me that fighting back was possible," he told me shortly before my release. "I thought I just had to accept whatever they did to me, but you proved that even in here, truth can win if you're brave enough to document it." Carlos Mendez used the connections I'd developed with advocacy groups to secure legal representation for his own case, getting his sentence reduced in exchange for cooperation with ongoing federal investigations into prison corruption. His success demonstrated that the network of support we'd built during our fight against Morrison could continue helping people long after the immediate crisis had been resolved. My preparation for life after prison involved practical planning, but also philosophical reflection about how my experience fighting institutional corruption had changed my fundamental understanding of justice, courage, and personal responsibility. I'd learned that ordinary people could expose extraordinary crimes if they were willing to accept the risks that came with standing up to powerful, corrupt systems. The letters from family expressing pride in my courage provided emotional support that was crucial to my psychological recovery. My sister Megan wrote regularly, sharing updates about her new life and expressing gratitude that my efforts to protect her had ultimately led to exposing crimes that had victimized dozens of other families. Her words helped me understand that the violence that had originally landed me in prison had ultimately created opportunities for meaningful, positive change. My parents, who had initially been ashamed of their son's criminal conviction, began speaking publicly about prison reform and the importance of protecting whistleblowers who expose institutional corruption. Their transformation from embarrassed silence to active advocacy reflected how my case had educated people about the realities of systematic abuse within the corrections system, the philosophy about justice, courage, and systemic change that emerged from my experience was rooted in the understanding that individuals had both the power and the responsibility to resist institutional corruption, even when the personal costs were enormous. Morrison's network had operated successfully for years because good people had remained silent when they witnessed abuse, either from fear or from the belief that their individual actions couldn't make a difference. My case proved that one person, with sufficient evidence and determination, could expose crimes that affected thousands of people. But it also demonstrated that such efforts required enormous personal sacrifice and often put whistleblowers at significant risk of retaliation. The decision to fight corruption was ultimately a moral choice that individuals had to make based on their own values and their willingness to accept the consequences of challenging powerful, entrenched systems. The educational opportunities I'd pursued while incarcerated not just the GED, but extensive reading about law, psychology, and institutional reform had prepared me for a life of advocacy and public service that I'd never imagined before entering prison. The traumatic experience of fighting Morrison's corruption had revealed talents and interests that would shape my future career and personal mission. The countdown to my release date was filled with mixed emotions: excitement about freedom and reunion with family, but also anxiety about readjusting to life outside institutional walls and uncertainty about how my notoriety as a prison reform advocate would affect my ability to build a normal life after serving my sentence. The prison reform bill that bore my name was signed into law on a crisp October morning, 18 months after my release from Riverside State Penitentiary. The Fletcher Prison Reform Act mandated body cameras for all correctional staff, established independent oversight committees with subpoena power, created federal protections for inmates who reported institutional misconduct. Watching the governor sign legislation that had emerged directly from my fight against Morrison's corruption was surreal and deeply meaningful. My release day had been surprisingly emotional, filled with goodbye embraces from inmates who credited me with giving them hope that justice was possible, even within corrupt systems. Charlie Washington, the electronics expert who'd modified my recording device, presented me with a small digital recorder as a parting gift. "Keep documenting the truth," he said with a grin. "The world needs more people willing to risk everything to expose what's really happening." The media interviews during my first weeks of freedom focused on my transformation from convicted felon to prison reform advocate, but I tried to keep the attention focused on the systematic problems rather than my personal story. Reporters wanted dramatic narratives about heroism and redemption. I wanted to discuss policy changes and institutional accountability measures that could prevent future victims from experiencing what I'd endured. The real heroes in this story are the people who took enormous risks to support someone they barely knew. Explained during one television interview, Detective Harrison, Attorney Walsh, Guard Richardson, who warned me about the murder plot, they could have stayed safe and silent, but they chose to do what was right, even when it put them in danger. The establishment of the Fletcher Foundation for prison reform grew naturally from the speaking engagements, consulting opportunities, and media attention that followed my release. The Foundation's mission was to provide legal support for inmates reporting institutional corruption, fund independent monitoring of correctional facilities, and advocate for policy changes that would prevent systematic abuse of vulnerable people. First major success was securing federal funding for anonymous reporting systems at prisons throughout 3 states, creating confidential channels for inmates to report misconduct without fear of retaliation from corrupt staff members. The program was directly modeled on the hidden recording system I'd used to document Morrison's crimes. Though it used official technology and legal procedures rather than contraband devices, Morrison's experience serving his sentence in the same type of facility where he'd victimized vulnerable inmates provided a form of poetic justice that was deeply satisfying. Reports from his current location indicated that he was struggling to adjust to life as a prisoner, experiencing the powerlessness and vulnerability that he'd exploited in others for 15 years. The irony of Morrison's situation wasn't lost on anyone familiar with his case. The man who'd built a criminal empire by exploiting inmates' desperation and fear was now completely dependent on the same institutional systems he'd corrupted for his own personal safety and basic needs. Fellow prisoners knew exactly what kind of person he was, and correctional staff treated him with the same casual indifference he'd shown to the people he'd victimized. My new life as an advocate and consultant involved traveling to facilities throughout the country, meeting with administrators, inmates, and staff members to discuss corruption prevention and institutional reform. The work was emotionally challenging because it required me to repeatedly revisit traumatic experiences, but it was also deeply meaningful because it created opportunities to prevent other people from suffering what I'd endured. The speaking engagements at law schools, police academies, corrections conferences provided platforms for educating future professionals about the warning signs of institutional corruption and the importance of protecting whistleblowers who expose systematic abuse. My presentations always emphasized that preventing corruption required active commitment from good people rather than passive hope that bad actors would somehow reform themselves. The letters I received from inmates throughout the country confirmed that Morrison's crimes weren't isolated incidents. part of a broader pattern of exploitation that existed in facilities across the nation. Men and women wrote to describe similar experiences of systematic abuse, financial exploitation, and institutional cover-ups that had destroyed their lives and traumatized their families. Each letter reinforced my understanding that the fight against prison corruption was far from over, and that the reforms achieved at Riverside represented just the beginning of what needed to be a sustained national effort to transform corrections. Systems that had operated with minimal oversight for decades. The lasting changes at Riverside State Penitentiary included not just policy modifications, but cultural transformation that made systematic corruption much more difficult to establish and maintain. The combination of technological monitoring, independent oversight, federal attention had created an environment where abuse was more likely to be detected, reported, and prosecuted. Warden Hutchinson, who embraced reform with genuine commitment, became a national spokesman for transparency and accountability in corrections management. His leadership during the institutional transformation at Riverside made him a model for administrators who wanted to prevent corruption rather than simply respond to scandals after they'd been exposed. My final reflection on the entire experience was that one person's courage to document truth and resist institutional corruption could create ripple effects that protected thousands of vulnerable people and changed systems that had operated with impunity for generations. The contraband recording device that had started as a desperate attempt at self-protection had become the foundation for policy changes that would benefit countless future inmates and their families. The call to action I offered to anyone who heard my story was simple but challenging. When you witness systematic abuse of power, you have a moral obligation to act, even when the personal costs are enormous. Remaining silent in the face of institutional corruption makes you complicit in the harm that results from your inaction. While speaking truth to power, no matter how dangerous, creates possibilities for justice and reform that would otherwise never exist. Like and subscribe if this story has inspired you to stand up against injustice in your own life. Because the fight for truth and accountability never ends. And it requires each of us to find the courage Morrison thought we'd never possess.